Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 22, Part 2. Littimer, with his habitual serenity quite undisturbed, announced, "Miss Moucher." I looked at the doorway and saw nothing. I was still looking at the doorway, thinking that Miss Moucher was a long while making her appearance, when, to my infinite astonishment, there came waddling round the sofa which stood between me and it a pursy dwarf of about 40 or 45, with a very large head and face, a pair of roguish grey eyes, and such extremely little arms that, to enable herself to lay a finger archly against her snub nose, as she ogled Steerforth, she was obliged to meet the finger halfway and lay her nose against it. Her chin, which was what is called a double chin, was so fat that it entirely swallowed up the strings of her bonnet, bow and all. Throat she had none, waist she had none, legs she had none worth mentioning, for though she was more than full-sized down to where her waist would have been, if she had had any, and though she terminated, as human beings generally do, in a pair of feet, she was so short that she stood at a common-sized chair, as at a table, resting her bag she carried on the seat. This lady, dressed in an offhand, easy style, bringing her nose and her forefinger together with the difficulty that I've described, standing with her head necessarily on one side and with one of her sharp eyes shut up, making an uncommonly knowing face, after ogling Steerforth for a few moments, broke into a torrent of words. "What, my flower?" she pleasantly began, shaking her large head at him. "You're there, are you? Oh, you naughty boy, fie for shame. What do you do so far away from home? Up to mischief, I'll be bound. Oh, you're a downy fellow, Steerforth, so you are, and I'm another, ain't I? Ha, ha, ha! You'd have betted £100 to 5 now that you wouldn't have seen me here, wouldn't you? Bless you, man alive, I'm everywhere. I'm here and there and where not, like the conjurer's half-crown in the lady's handkerchief. Talking of handkerchiefs and talking of ladies, what a comfort you are to your blessed mother, ain't you, my dear boy, over one of my shoulders, and I don't say which." Miss Moucher untied her bonnet at this passage of her discourse, threw back the strings, and sat down panting on a footstool in front of the fire, making a kind of arbour of the dining table which spread its mahogany shelter above her head. "Oh, my stars, and what's their names?" she went on, clapping a hand on each of her little knees and glancing shrewdly at me. "I am of too full a habit, that's the fact, Steerforth. After a flight of stairs, it gives me as much trouble to draw every breath I want as if it was a bucket of water. If you saw me looking out of an upper window, you'd think I was a fine woman, wouldn't you?" "I should think that wherever I saw you," replied Steerforth. "Go along, you dog, do!" cried the little creature, making a whisk at him with her handkerchief with which she was wiping her face. "And don't be impudent. But I give you my word and honour, I was at Lady Mithers's last week. There's a woman! How she wears! And Mithers himself came into the room where I was waiting for. There's a man! How he wears! And his wig, too, for he's had it these 10 years. And he went on at that rate in the complimentary line that I began to think I should be obliged to ring the bell. Ha, ha, ha! He's a pleasant wretch, but he wants principle." "What were you doing for Lady Mithers?" asked Steerforth. "That's telling, my blessed infant," she retorted, tapping her nose again, screwing up her face and twinkling her eyes like an imp of supernatural intelligence. "Never you mind. You'd like to know whether I stop her hair from falling off, or dye it, or touch up her complexion, or improve her eyebrows, wouldn't you? And so you shall, my darling, when I tell you. Do you know what my great-grandfather's name was?" "No," said Steerforth. "It was Walker, my sweet pet," replied Miss Moucher. "And he came of a long line of Walkers, while I inherit all the Hookey estates from." I never beheld anything approaching to Miss Moucher's wink, except Miss Moucher's self-possession. She had a wonderful way, too, when listening to what was said to her, or when waiting for an answer to what she had said herself, of pausing, with her head cunningly on one side and one eye turned up like a magpie's. Altogether I was lost in amazement, and sat staring at her, quite oblivious, I'm afraid, of the laws of politeness. She had by this time drawn the chair to her side, and was busily engaged in producing from the bag, plunging in her short arm to the shoulder at every dive, a number of small bottles, sponges, combs, brushes, bits of flannel, little pairs of curling irons, and other instruments which she tumbled in a heap upon the chair. From this employment she suddenly desisted, and said to Steerforth, much to my confusion, "Who's your friend?" "Mr. Copperfield," said Steerforth. "He wants to know you." "Well, then he shall. I thought he looked as if he did," returned Miss Moucher, waddling up to me, bag in hand, and laughing on me as she came. "Face like a peach," standing on tiptoe to pinch my cheek as I sat. "Quite tempting. I'm very fond of peaches. Happy to make your acquaintance, Mr. Copperfield, I'm sure." I said that I congratulated myself on having the honor to make hers, and that the happiness was mutual. "Oh, my goodness, how polite we are!" exclaimed Miss Moucher, making a preposterous attempt to cover her large face with her morsel of a hand. "What a world of gammon and spinach it is, though, ain't it?" This was addressed confidentially to both of us, as the morsel of a hand came away from the face and buried itself, arm and all, in the bag again. "What do you mean, Miss Moucher?" said Steerforth. "Ha, ha, ha! What a refreshing set of humbugs we are, to be sure, ain't we, my sweet child?" replied that morsel of a woman, feeling in the bag with her head on one side and her eye in the air. "Look here," taking something out. "Scraps of Russian prince's nails, prince alphabet turned topsy-turvy, I call him, for his name's got all the letters in it, higgledy-piggledy." "The Russian prince is a client of yours, is he?" said Steerforth. "I believe you, my pet," replied Miss Moucher. "I keep his nails in order for him twice a week, fingers and toes." "He pays well, I hope," said Steerforth. "Pays as he speaks, my dear child, through the nose," replied Miss Moucher. "None of your close shavers, the prince ain't. You'd say so if you saw his mustachios, red by nature, black by art." "By your art, of course," said Steerforth. Miss Moucher winked assent. "Forced to send for me, couldn't help it. The climate affected his dye. It did very well in Russia, but it was no good here. You never saw such a rusty prince in all your born days as he was, like old iron." "Is that why you called him a humbug just now?" inquired Steerforth. "Oh, you're a broth of a boy, ain't you?" returned Miss Moucher, shaking her head violently. "I said what a set of humbugs we were in general, and I showed you the scraps of the prince's nails to prove it." The prince's nails do more for me in private families of the genteel sort than all my talents put together. I always carry them about. They're the best introduction. If Miss Moucher cuts the prince's nails, she must be all right. I give 'em away to the young ladies. They put 'em in albums, I believe. Upon my life, this whole social system, as the men call it when they make speeches in Parliament, is a system of prince's nails, said this least of a woman, trying to fold her short arms and nodding her large head. Steerforth laughed heartily, and I laughed too. Miss Moucher continuing all the time to shake her head, which was very much on one side, and to look into the air with one eye and to wink with the other. Well, well, she said, smiting her small knees and rising, this is not business. Come, Steerforth, let's explore the polar regions and have it over. She then selected 2 or 3 of the little instruments and a little bottle, and asked, to my surprise, if the table would bear. On Steerforth's replying in the affirmative, she pushed a chair against it, and, begging the assistance of my hand, mounted up pretty nimbly to the top as if it were a stage. If either of you saw my ankles, she said, when she was safely elevated, say so, and I'll go home and destroy myself. I did not, said Steerforth. I did not, said I. Well then, cried Miss Moucher. Well then, cried Miss Moucher, I'll consent to live. Now, ducky, 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 come to Mrs. Bond and be killed. This was an invitation to Steerforth to place himself under her hands, who accordingly sat himself down with his back to the table and his laughing face towards me, and submitted his head to her inspection, evidently for no other purpose than our entertainment. To see Miss Moucher standing over him, looking at his rich profusion of brown hair through a large round magnifying glass which she took out of her pocket, was a most amazing spectacle. You're a pretty fellow, said Miss Moucher, after a brief inspection. You'd be as bald as a friar on the top of your head in 12 months but for me. Just half a minute, my young friend, and we'll give you a polishing that shall keep your curls on for the next 10 years. With this, she tilted some of the contents of the little bottle onto one of the little bits of flannel, and again imparting some of the virtues of that preparation to one of the little brushes, began rubbing and scraping away with both on the crown of Steerforth's head in the busiest manner I ever witnessed, talking all the time. There's Charlie Pygrave, the Duke's son, she said. You know Charlie? Peeping round into his face. A little, said Steerforth. What a man he is! There's a whisker! As to Charlie's legs, if they were only a pair, which they ain't, they'd defy competition. Would you believe he tried to do without me, in the Life Guards, too? Mad, said Steerforth. It looks like it. However mad or sane, he tried, returned Miss Moucher. What does he do but, lo and behold you, he goes into a perfumer's shop and wants to buy a bottle of the Madagascar liquid. Charlie does, said Steerforth. Charlie does, but they haven't got any Madagascar liquid. What is it, something to drink? Asked Steerforth. To drink, returned Miss Moucher, stopping to slap his cheek. To doctor his mustachios with, you know. There was a woman in the shop, elderly female, quite a griffin, who had never even heard of it by name. Begging pardon, sir, said the griffin to Charlie. It's not rouge, is it? Rouge, said Charlie to the griffin. What the unmentionable two ears polite do you think I want with rouge? No offence, sir, said the griffin. We have it asked for by so many names I thought it might be. Now, that, my child, continued Miss Moucher, rubbing all the time as busily as ever, is another instance of the refreshing humbug I was speaking of. I do something in that way myself. Perhaps a good deal, perhaps a little. Sharp's the word, my dear boy. Never mind." "In what way do you mean? In the rouge way?" said Steerforth. "Put this and that together, my tender pupil," returned the wary Moucher, touching her nose. "Work it by the rule of secrets in all trades, and the product will give you the desired result. I say I do a little in that way myself. One dowager, she calls it lip salve. Another, she calls it gloves. Another, she calls it tucker edging. Another, she calls it a fan. I call it whatever they call it. I supply it for 'em, but we keep up the trick so to one another, and make believe with such a face that they'd as soon think of laying it on before a whole drawing-room as before me. And when I wait upon 'em, they'll say to me sometimes, with it on, thick and no mistake, 'How am I looking, Moucher? Am I pale?' Isn't that refreshing, my young friend?" I never did in my days behold anything like Moucher as she stood upon the dining table, intensely enjoying this refreshment, rubbing busily at Steerforth's head and winking at me over it. "Ah," she said, "such things are not much in demand hereabouts. That sets me off again. I haven't seen a pretty woman since I've been here, Jemmy." "No?" said Steerforth. "Not the ghost of one," replied Miss Moucher. "We could show her the substance of one, I think," said Steerforth, addressing his eyes to mine. "Eh, Daisy?" "Yes, indeed," said I. "Aha!" cried the little creature, glancing sharply at my face and then peeping round at Steerforth's. "Humph?" The first exclamation sounded like a question put to both of us, and the second like a question put to Steerforth only. She seemed to have found no answer to either, but continued to rub with her head on one side and her eye turned up, as if she were looking for an answer in the air and were confident of its appearing presently. "A sister of yours, Mr. Copperfield?" she cried after a pause, and still keeping the same lookout. "Aye. "No," said Steerforth, before I could reply. "Nothing of the sort. On the contrary, Mr. Copperfield used, or I am much mistaken, to have a great admiration for her." "Why, hasn't he now?" returned Miss Moucher. "Is he fickle? Oh, for shame! Did he sip every flower and change every hour until Polly his passion requited? Is her name Polly?" The elfin suddenness with which she pounced upon me with this question, and a searching look, quite disconcerted me for a moment. "No, Miss Moucher," I replied. Her name is Emily." "Aha!" she cried, exactly as before. "Humph! What a rattle I am, Mr. Copperfield. Ain't I volatile?" Her tone and look implied something that was not agreeable to me in connection with the subject, so I said in a graver manner than any of us had yet assumed, "She is as virtuous as she is pretty. She is engaged to be married to a most worthy and deserving man in her own station of life. I esteem her for her good sense as much as I admire her for her good looks." "Well said," cried Steerforth. "Hear, hear. Here, now I'll quench the curiosity of this little Fatima, my dear Daisy, by leaving her nothing to guess at. She is at present apprenticed, Miss Moucher, or articled, or whatever it may be, to Omer and Joram, haberdashers, milliners, and so forth, in this town. Do you observe Omer and Joram? The promise of which my friend has spoken is made and entered into with her cousin, Christian name Ham, surname Peggotty, occupation boat builder, also of this town. She lives with a relative, Christian name unknown, surname Peggotty, occupation seafaring, also of this town. She is the prettiest and most engaging little fairy in the world. I admire her, as my friend does, exceedingly. If it were not that I might appear to disparage her intended, which I know my friend would not like, I would add that to me she seems to be throwing herself away, that I am sure she might do better, and that I swear she was born to be a lady. Miss Moucher listened to these words, which were very slowly and distinctly spoken, with her head on one side and her eye in the air, as if she was still looking for that answer. When he ceased, she became brisk again in an instant, and rattled away with surprising volubility. "Oh, and that's all about it, is it?" she exclaimed, trimming his whiskers with a little restless pair of scissors that went glancing round his head in all directions. Very well. Quite a long story. Ought to end, and they lived happily ever afterwards, oughtn't it? What's that game at forfeits? I love my love with an E because she's enticing. I hate her with an E because she's engaged. I took her to the sign of the Exquisite and treated her with an elopement. Her name's Emily, and she lives in the East. Ha, Mr. Copperfield, ain't I volatile? Merely looking at me with extravagant slyness and not waiting for any reply, she continued without drawing breath, "There, if ever any scapegrace was trimmed and touched up to perfection, you are, Steerforth. If I understand any noddle in the world, I understand yours. Do you hear me when I tell you that, my darling? I understand yours," peeping down into his face. "Now you may mizzle, Jemmy, as we say at court, and if Mr. Copperfield will take the chair, I'll operate on him." "What do you say, Daisy?" inquired Steerforth, laughing and resigning his seat. "Will you be improved?" "Thank you, Miss Moucher, not this evening." "Don't say no," returned the little woman, looking at me with the aspect of a connoisseur. "A little more eyebrow?" "Thank you," I returned. "Some other time." "Have it carried half a quarter of an inch towards the temple," said Miss Moucher. "We can do it in a fortnight." "No, I thank you, not at present." "Go in for a tip," she urged. "No, let's get the scaffolding up then for a pair of whiskers. Come." I could not help blushing as I declined, for I felt we were on my weak point now. But Miss Moucher, finding that I was not at present disposed for any decoration within the range of her art, and that I was for the time being proof against the blandishments of the small bottle which she held up before one eye to enforce her persuasions, said we would make a beginning on an early day, and requested the aid of my hand to descend from her elevated station. Thus assisted, she skipped down with much agility and began to tie her double chin into her bonnet. "The fee," said Steerforth, "is—" "5 bob," replied Miss Moucher. "And dirt cheap, my chicken, ain't I volatile, Mr. Copperfield?" I replied politely, "Not at all." But I thought she was rather so, when she tossed up his 2 half-crowns like a goblin pieman, caught them, dropped them in her pocket, and gave it a loud slap. "That's the till," observed Miss Moucher, standing at the chair again and replacing in the bag a miscellaneous collection of little objects she had emptied out of it. "Have I got all my traps? It seems so. It won't do to be like long Ned Beadwood when they took him to church to marry him to somebody, as he says, and left the bride behind. Ha, ha, ha! A wicked rascal, Ned, but droll. Now, I know I'm going to break your hearts, but I'm forced to leave you. You must call up all your fortitude and try to bear it. Goodbye, Mr. Copperfield. Take care of yourself, jockey of Norfolk. How I have been rattling on. It's all the fault of you two wretches. I forgive you. Bob swore, as the Englishman said for good night when he first learnt French and thought it so like English. Bob swore, me ducks. With the bag slung over her arm and rattling as she waddled away, she waddled to the door, where she stopped to inquire if she should leave us a lock of her hair. Ain't I volatile? She added, as a commentary on this offer, and with her finger on her nose, departed. Steerforth laughed to that degree that it was impossible for me to help laughing too, though I'm not sure I should have done so but for this inducement. When we had had our laugh quite out, which was after some time, he told me that Miss Moucho had quite an extensive connection and made herself useful to a variety of people in a variety of ways. Some people trifled with her as a mere oddity, he said, but she was as shrewdly and sharply observant as anyone he knew, and as long-headed as she was short-armed. He told me that what she had said of being here and there and everywhere was true enough, for she made little darts into the provinces and seemed to pick up customers everywhere and to know everybody. I asked him what her disposition was, whether it was at all mischievous, and if her sympathies were generally on the right side of things, but not succeeding in attracting his attention to these questions after 2 or 3 attempts, I forbore or forgot to repeat them. He told me instead, with much rapidity, a good deal about her skill and her profits, and about her being a scientific cupper, if I should ever have occasion for her service in that capacity. She was the principal theme of our conversation during the evening, and when we parted for the night, Steerforth called after me over the banisters, "Bob swore," as he went downstairs. Thanks for joining me. We conclude Chapter 22, Part 3 of Chapter 22 tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. I hope you're having a lovely July the 4th weekend. I will read tomorrow, but I fully understand that people might have other things that they're going to be doing, in which case you can always get the synopsis that I post on YouTube and on Instagram, or you can listen to the whole thing in your own time on the Instagram channel Fireside Reading. Until I see you again, please stay very well. Good night.